Cool. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first webinar of this new year. So happy New Year to everyone. And our New Year's first speaker is Steve Smoot. He is Corelight's Chief Customer Officer, and he is going to be talking about designing logs in the real world. So take it away, Steve.
Happy to. Yeah, maybe a little odd for a chief customer officer to be talking about Zeek scripts and spicy analyzers, but we're a fairly technical company, so there you go. I looked through the history of all the talks that I could find on Zeek, and I only really found one on thinking about what you put in your logs. And I felt like they had like 20 ideas and they only had time to cover like four. So hopefully you'll at least get a few more ideas out of this one. Uh, so I'm going to start by telling a story. So this is a real story, but it's somewhat of a fairy tale in that I've altered the facts a bit to improve the story and to for those who remember Dragnet, protect the innocent as well. And then I'm going to go through and sort of recap it and for Zeek, and then recap it for Spicy, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So, story time. A lot of people who are in the security field but not actual full-time security researchers, I think, have this model in their head of how research gets done. And it's something like uh, customer finds something that's going on, and you work with them, and they show you all the details of what's going on and their ideas about how to detect things or fix things or whatever. And then you create a great Zeek script that creates a log, and they use the log to kick out the bad guys, and everybody's happy. And what I found in the real world, very little of that model is actually true. So we had a customer at Corelight who was under active attack, and they're like, "Hey, how do we enable a parser for this specific protocol?" And the answer, unfortunately, was Zeek doesn't have one, right? And there wasn't one in open source, there wasn't one at Corelight, but that sort of bugged me. And so, we told them, gave them bad news, and gave some suggestions on what you could do with the, con log, etc. But it bugged me, and it was Friday, and I didn't have a lot to do that weekend, and I'd written a couple spicy parsers already, so I said, well, why don't I see how hard this is? And so over the weekend, I did what I could. And just to be clear, I'm not going to tell you the customer name or the protocol. I'm trying to obscure all those details for confidentiality, and for other reasons that I think will become clear. So just FYI on that. But okay, so that's just a bit of foreshadowing. So I took the weekend and I worked on it, and I, of course, very quickly, realized, hey, this is definitely a spicy project. So for anybody who's unfamiliar, if you're just coming from Zeek world, spicy is a cool scripting language for describing protocols. It helps you extend Zeek much more easily than BinPAC did. It takes a lot of the same sort of grammar-based concepts, but just does it better, right? And like I said, I'd done a couple already at the time, and so I somewhat knew my way around. Yeah, my warning, by the way, your first day on Spicy is very hard. but but anyway, so this protocol was public in that there are 3 or 4 RFCs that talk about it. And I figured, hey, it's been around a long time. It'll be easy to get some PCAPs. I can test the parser on that, find what they want, write a good Zeek log for it, and send it to them. Spoiler, it is never easy to get PCAPs. So turns out, scouring the internet for PCAPs, I got, I don't know, 3 or 4. Definitely was enough to get me started. Definitely not enough for you to feel like confident you've got, a lot of test cases here. But anyway, by Monday, I had I had it working. I thought, okay, this is like covers 80%, right, of the protocol. In particular, like auth was covered. Some other info that seemed likely to be what they would be looking for in the log was covered. So bundled it up and sent it over to them. And I heard nothing. A couple days go by, and finally I like ping them, hey, like, was this useful? Right. So and they say, yes, thank you. This is great. And I'm like, okay, should I, there's some stuff I didn't do. Should I work on that? What, is it giving you the information you need? And basically I got back, yes, you should absolutely work on it. No, we're not going to tell you whether it gives us what we need or not, but we could use more. Like, okay, all right, well, hopefully the more is in that 20%. So I go off and I work on that some more. Uh, and I also knew, like, one thing you do when you're doing a protocol is you look at Wireshark and you look at what you're doing out of Zeek and Spicy, right? And how do they compare, right? So I knew that there were differences and that I should work on them. So did that, send them a new rev, and then, okay, is this what you want? And basically, all right, let me do a bit of a tangent. So Zeek logs are opinionated. I don't know if you've ever really thought about this, but in writing and designing the logs, uh, over time, the sort of Zeek community is focused on the security angles of the protocols, and you have opinions like, okay, this might be useful to 1% of the people. That's not enough. It's available in Zeek if you want to add it to your log, but it's not actually logged. Or this, everybody's going to want to know, the URL in HTTP, right? So yes, clearly we're going to log that. And they don't contain everything, right? Because if you want everything, you may as well be doing a packet capture, right? It's more space efficient, it's more CPU efficient. You just, build an efficient write it to disk kind of thing, and then you can, process it with Wireshark or some other way. All right. So you typically don't want everything. You want the right stuff, which means you need to have opinions about what the right stuff is. And all I was getting from them is, we need more. They wouldn't tell me what. And I said, okay, well, also, by the way, I need more PCAPs. Can you just send me some of the PCAPs? And no, they weren't going to share with PCAPs either. I didn't even ask for, like, the bad ones, like, just, any, right? Because I just need to know, I need more volume. So that's where we were. So it was a bit of a puzzle, which is a definite problem for making an opinionated log. So I changed the code to create two logs. I created the protocol log and an all log, where the protocol log had sort of what I thought you'd want to know. And the all log had everything that I could find out about the protocol. I figured, okay, this way, all maybe too much volume, right? Maybe, I don't remember what sim they had, maybe blowing out their Splunk, whatever. But that's their problem because they're not telling me what little stuff they want. So we give them the all, and then I'm like, okay, well, now that you can see everything, what from this do you want to go into the opinionated log? I call it the protocol log, but nope, still won't tell me. So, okay, like I said, I've been working on that 20% that I knew I hadn't covered, and then, of course, as I did that 20%, I found out there was another 20 or 30, 40% that I also wasn't doing, that I didn't know that I wasn't doing. So that's sort of the underwater part of the iceberg. In particular, while there were RFCs, vendors, sometimes they implement the RFC correctly, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they extend it, and sometimes the RFCs, you may be looking at a 10-year-old doc that says, okay, in the future, everybody does it this way, the old way is deprecated, and everything you actually find on the internet does it the deprecated way. So, so real world and ivory tower sometimes don't match. And I got a tiny amount of feedback from them that some of the logs looked sort of funny, right? Which sort of, to me, implies, hey, there's a bug, right? But again, no details, all confidential, can't share it. Okay, so I really need more PCAPs. I broadcast out to my network, hey, does anybody have this kind of traffic on their network that they can send me a PCAP of? And I actually got some, so that was fantastic. And in particular, I got one that sort of taught me that auth didn't quite work the way that I thought it did, which gave me ideas for how to improve the opinionated log, and so it was all good. So thank you to everybody who sent me files. And then I realized if you're not if you're going to get very light feedback, you need a third log, which is an error log. And my concept here was like take vendor extensions, right? You suddenly see a field that's not specified in the protocol. Well, what do you do with it, right? If it's a constrained enough protocol, you can actually figure out how to log it probably. In my case, I was like, hey, I'm just going to log this to an error log, but I need some prayer that they're going to actually give me feedback about it, right? So I did a bunch of work to like just limit it to like say the field name for that example, so that I knew it was not going to have any PII, right? It's not going to have any intellectual property. It's going to be hard for them to share. And also that gives you a sort of small, unique string so that you can easily keep a table of here are all the new strings I've seen in the last 24 hours. So, so you constrain the amount of memory, et cetera. So I'm not going to generate a very big log. And so I could say, hey, if you could periodically send me the error log, it should be easy for you all to, approve, get it through the inspection that it's not leaking information and send it back. So that even in a sort of hands-off environment like this, you can get feedback. And so I added that. But no, I still didn't get any feedback. Still a desert out there. Just a quick tangent on spicy. So spicy is new. And I mean, it's not new, but it's new. It's new enough that versions matter. And so one of the screw ups I made in doing this was I started developing it on my laptop. And so I used the version that was on my laptop. And I got it all to work. And then did I test it before I sent it to them? I tested on the PCAPs, but I don't have live traffic, so I didn't bother to load it on a sensor. And then, of course, I found out that the sensor version of Spicy and the version of my laptop were not the same, and so the language is different between the two, so it didn't work for them. So lesson learned there. Pay attention to where you're going to be deploying and the versions that are running there when you're doing development. Probably an obvious lesson, but there are a couple things in the story of ways I've stubbed my toe that I just want to help you not do. So, all right. And then once I had the script, like I said, this is my third or so project. Um, and because I had this version mismatch, and it was actually the sensor version was older and had a bug that had been resolved by the version on my laptop. So anyway, when I tried to support the old version, I was mystified it was wrong. So I started working with the spicy open source team. And so thank you to them for figuring it out. And when I shared my code with them, they said, hey, this part's great, but here you sort of, this is not spicy like you sort of go off into procedure land. Um, and that's happened to me since. So I want to highlight this as another potential stub your toe place. So as you're figuring out a protocol, it may be really hard to nail the grammar. And at least in my case, I get tempted to just sort of switch into if statements and some various parsing tools that Story has a good library for. And you get it all to work. And now you've got it to work. And so do you really go back and convert it into what it should have been? And my answer is actually that's a line you need to navigate, right? So sometimes totally, like if you were building this for production, it's going to run on millions of machines. Yeah, you want to go back and do that. If it's one project for one customer, maybe you don't need to clean that up. So see whether it's long lived and just decide whether you want to do that. Also, basically you learn a lot in doing that. So it's still on my to-do list is the honest answer here. I think that it would be more performant, but I do now understand like how I can do it. So sometime I may get around to it. So to wrap it all up, wrap up phase one of this, you can develop in the dark, but it's best to come in with some patterns to follow, and then keep trying to get the feedback. I think that this pattern, which I'll talk about a little more, is a good one. It's come up subsequently in some other projects where I had similar challenges and needed to work around them. So with that, I'm going to sort of recap it for Zeek and then for Spicy. So the log ideas. So the idea here is, or the recognition is that Zeek logs are opinionated. And the structure I found to be useful was to have the opinionated log, an all log, and an error log. Uh, and then, of course, they're not going to be called that, right? So, if it was HTTP, it'd be HTTP, HTTP all, and HTTP error. Um, and then think about the opinions a lot, right? Because that's the one you want people to be using. The all is nice to have to go back to, right? If things like a sensor, you could split it off into different storage, for example, and so you always have that. But you probably don't want people to be reading it, right? Um, depending on the protocol, you may have like ACK, very boring log message, right? Or set it to 5. Okay, it's 5, right? Not interesting messages, but they're part of the all. And then give people hooks, right? You've got a couple different ways you can use redefs or the options framework within Zeek to let the people configure which flavor they want and what they want to do with it. So that was lesson one. I had another idea when I was working on a different protocol, which was this protocol I can talk about, but this was internal to a company, and it's sort of between layers in their application stack. And so when I was writing the parser, I thought, you might use Zeek for security here, but you might also use it to find bugs. Like you've got a vendor on this side and a vendor on this side. They could end up pointing fingers, or you may have an internal project and a external project, right? You may end up with people pointing fingers, and the Zeek log could help people say like, oh, here was a protocol violation, or here is something a little odd, right? And so I didn't know if this was really an error, right? Because I think protocol errors, if you can find the errors, that should go in the error log. But it's more like linting, right? Or more like protocol weird, like. And this could also be useful for security. So there was an Okta vulnerability recently, like where you could put in really long usernames and trigger a bypass, I think, right? So like maybe I don't expect the username to be more than 50 characters, right? That could go into this log. It's not an error. Protocol allows it, right? But or whatever the limit is. But yet it may be interesting from a security point of view. So maybe it just should go in the opinionated log. But anyway, I highlighted that as a potential thing to think about when you're doing your logs. It could help you find 0 days or end days in the future. Certainly help you find fuzzing. A sophisticated attack, they're not going to actually be fuzzing against your live system. They're going to have a copy of it, and you won't see the traffic, but still. So just to recap, it's harder than it looks in the movies. It may not match your mental model as to how this process is all going to work. You may need access to traffic and not have it. You may want access to the indicators of compromise and not have it. And you may get much less feedback than you really think you should. But yet you still can succeed. This project was successful. There are still more improvements to do, but it's currently on the plus column. All right, that was the Zeek side. What about the spicy side? So yeah, I mentioned one already. Use the right version. So this is a common pattern where it is easier to develop in open source, even if your production is non-open or is a product, right? So a platform for running Zeek, for example. So align those in advance. There are lots of reasons why it's easier. I don't know. Anybody who's tried, I think will know them. But like to be in production, you have to bundle things. You have much less access to debugging statements. You know, it's you you may have less control over the traffic, right? Running on PCAPs is definitely the way you want to start. Or actually, for Spicy, running on text strings is the way you want to start. There's more of that to come. But PCAPs are the next level. And when you run into issues with versions, the preprocessor has code for that, right? So in my case, what I should have done when I realized this was sort of, check on the versions and call the right code. Um, Having made this mistake multiple times, mostly on the Zeek side, when you realize, hey, I need a Zeek 7 feature and I'm designing for 6, write them both. Uh, Otherwise, you're just creating tech debt for future you to go and remember to fix when 7 comes out, or I guess 7.2 comes out in this case. So just uh, leverage this feature when you're writing your scripts. And if you get the sort of new code stuff wrong, well, it's going to be a lot more useful for people who are debugging it in the future to go in and say, "Ooh, look, they were testing a version thing. Let's figure out what they were doing in the working code and how you actually do that in 7.2," right? So, um, a good tip for that. And then iterate on your grammar. So, like I said, there's definitely a common pattern of um, falling into procedural evaluations. Depending on your protocol, like some protocols are just so well laid out, like it's this bit field and this bit field and this, you have no need to do this. But other ones, especially sort of old internet-y protocols, are not like that. They're ASCII based, and they've had hack after hack or revision after revision, improving them over the years. And so it's a definite thing to watch out for. But I'm not arguing for the hardcore. It must all be in the grammar. Um, kind of script design. ZKG. Okay, another way to cause yourself heartache is a bad habit I have, which is, well, this project's sort of like that project, so I'm just gonna cp-r that directory and start with that, right? Because I know that one already works. Whereas if I start from ZKG, like, I don't know, it's gonna not work, right? Well, it turns out the ZKG templates are much better than a lot of the old code that's sitting around there. So use ZKG to create a new template. It will help you help yourself. In particular, even after I started using it, I failed to realize sort of the point in the two different spicy files. So there's but sort of by default creates you an analyzer.spicy and I can't remember, analyzer zeek.spicy, something like that. And the bad pattern I had was basically getting the PCAPs as fast as possible, right? Because PCAPs are my real traffic. I'm thinking about running in production. I don't really care about the spicy stuff. I totally need it to bootstrap. But in my head, I just want to get to Zeek as quickly as possible. And it turns out that's a really bad idea. And so the reason it's a bad idea is if you successfully segment the pure messages that you're working on, as opposed to the sort of packetized version, the calling Zeek version, you can write so much better test cases because they're text files. So if you don't have a PCAP that has the particular thing, you could just go and edit it, edit the text file, make a new test case that does that. And if your code, can only run with Zeek reading from the network, it's way harder, right? And so it's much better to do that. And it also can help with compilation. Like you can, if you don't need the Zeek stuff, you can compile a lot less code. It can be faster. You just have a faster development loop. And I say here, think carefully between what's in Zeek and what's in Spicy. Maybe it's just be flexible. So it may be that you want to do something, you think Spicy, in my case, I had this thing I was doing. I thought Spicy was going to be faster because it's compiled. And so I pushed a bunch of the stuff into Spicy. And it turned out it may have run faster. I don't know. but it compiled way slower, and that was a big drag on the project, even in debug mode. And so that's been improved by the Spicy team, but it was a part of a reason to move actually that stuff into Zeek. And it may not have ended up much slower because it turned out like a lot of that stuff was optional. So that was one pattern to watch out for. Another one that I've seen is sometimes you're sort of tempted to overdo it in Spicy. Like say your protocol is an enum or whatever, an option, you've got like, 150 different versions of this field. They're just integers and then they have different values. You can like name all those in Spicy, but unless you're really gonna use that, I don't think you want to. I think for most logs, given that you're trying to create an opinionated log that, focuses on when the values are 17, 92, or 12, like you don't need, it's not productive to have these giant case statements, switch statements, that spell out the enum. So think about like how you're going to actually use that data as you're designing it. So those are some tips there. And then testing, this is a follow-on I sort of talked about on the last slide a little bit, which is if you so you really want to have text input to test your Spicy code, especially for B tests and all that stuff. You may not have a good source of them. And it turns out Robin had already thought of that. And so he wrote this record Spicy batch that will take the PCAP and give you the input to Spicy. So so you don't have to like try and figure it all out by hand. You clearly will do the first ones that way, but you don't have to do all of them that way. And then this is just a marvelous tool for creating a bunch of test cases so you can edit them and have much better B tests than I currently have in my code. Very important tip there. And then finally, maintenance. So for Spicy parsers, like I said, the language changes, and that makes upgrades more challenging, more risky. And so most of us know there's a common pattern of you test in the lab before you deploy to production. I just want to double down that while Zeek perhaps is stable enough that this is less important, it's still pretty important, I think, for Zeek too, but it's less important than it is for Spicy. It's definitely, it's still a one dot type version. So you really want to test on a test sensor before you go into production. With that, any questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve, for the great presentation. And let's just open the floor up for any questions from our attendees.
And sort of while they're doing that, I'll also just present my thank yous.
Awesome. Oh, there is a question from Christian, so let me allow him to talk. Christian, you should be able to.
Right. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great, cool. Smoot,
Yes.
nobody does story time as you do. So thank you for this awesome talk. It's really fun. I'm curious if you could confirm an observation that I think we've had over the years, which is that it's perhaps not worth sort of obsessing about getting logs right in like V1, because you'll find that, as you start using the data, the questions you can answer with them might sort of deviate a little bit from what you had in mind originally, and then you start to sort of, iterate on the format sort of anyway. I don't know if that's something that has come up a bunch for you, but this is sort of something that we've seen in several of our logs over the years.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the pattern I propose sort of helps with that, right? So all is there to back you up if you got it wrong for the opinionated one. And so that it helps cover both.
Yeah, makes sense. Oh, maybe and one more thing. Thank you for calling out the ZKG templates. So this is perhaps worth flagging. This is very much sort of work in progress, and we sort of we always have more ideas for things we could put in those templates to make it easier for people to get going, but we also don't want to overdo it, sort of. So for example, like the extent to which we wanted to put tests in there from the get-go was sort of somewhat debatable, because it might really depend on the case at hand, to which extent you can even sort of, think of sort of boiling a test that is suitable. But if people have thoughts about that, that is a really valuable input for us. So the basics, I think, should be covered at this point. But if folks have other ideas, then that'd be great to hear. Thanks.
This advertisement brought to you by.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Looks like we don't have any further questions. And with that, thank you so much, Steve, for again taking out some time and giving us this amazing presentation. So thank you so much and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year,
Before
everybody.
before we adjourn for today, I just wanted to plug in our next webinar that is going to happen in 2 weeks from now. It's on 22nd of January, and our next speaker at the same time, next speaker would be Arnie from Corelight, and then he will be talking about pluggable cluster backends. So really excited to look out for that presentation as well. So hope you guys have a nice rest of the day, and I'll see you guys next time. So thank you again for joining, and thanks again, Steve, for presenting. Thank you.
Cheers, my pleasure.